welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be exploring the surprising truth about hygiene and cleanliness in medieval Europe, following the daily routines and practices of ordinary people as they maintained their health and appearance in ways that might challenge everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. Make sure to like this video to support our channel, and let us know in the comments where you are settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is. The morning sun filtered through the oiled parchment window of Agnes's small chamber above her father's bakery in the town of Norwich in the year 1347. She was 16 years old, the eldest daughter of Master Thomas the baker, and she woke each morning before dawn to begin her daily routine. The first task, even before dressing, was to wash her face and hands. A wooden basin sat on a small table near the window, and Agnes poured water from an earthenware pitcher into it, the water cold enough to make her gasp as she splashed it on her face. She used a small piece of linen cloth to scrub her skin, paying particular attention to her eyes and around her nose and mouth. The act of washing upon waking was so deeply ingrained in her routine that she would have felt unclean and uncomfortable proceeding with her day without it. After washing her face, Agnes turned her attention to her teeth. She kept a small wooden box on the table that contained her grooming tools. Inside was a collection of items that would surprise many who believed medieval people neglected personal hygiene. There was a toothcloth, a small square of linen that she wrapped around her finger and used to scrub her teeth. She dipped it first into a small pot of powder her mother made from ground sage, salt, and burnt rosemary. The mixture was abrasive and strongly flavoured, and Agnes worked it over her teeth methodically, front and back, scrubbing away the film that had accumulated overnight. The salt stung her gums slightly, but she knew this kept them healthy and her breath fresh. Some wealthier families used powders made with ground cuttlefish bone or pumice, but her mother's mixture worked well enough. In addition to the toothcloth, Agnes also used a toothpick carefully carved from a goose quill. She worked it gently between her teeth, dislodging any food particles that remained from the previous evening's meal. The parish priest had once preached about the importance of clean teeth and fresh breath, saying that foul breath offended both God and one's neighbours. Medical texts that Agnes had heard discussed at her father's shop spoke of diseases that came from corrupted humours in the mouth, and everyone knew that tooth pain was among the worst afflictions a person could suffer. Prevention through regular cleaning was far preferable to the agony of extraction. Once her face and teeth were clean, Agnes turned to her hair. She unpinned the linen cap she had slept in and shook her long brown hair loose. It fell past her shoulders in waves, and she began the daily task of combing it. Her comb was made of boxwood, with fine teeth on one side and coarser teeth on the other. She started with the coarse side, working through any tangles from the night, beginning at the ends and working her way up to avoid breaking the hair. Then she switched to the fine-toothed side and combed thoroughly from scalp to tips, the repetitive motion soothing in its familiarity. This daily combing served multiple purposes. It distributed the natural oils from her scalp along the length of her hair, keeping it healthy and giving it a subtle shine. It also helped remove any dirt or debris, and most importantly, it checked for lice. Lice were a constant concern in medieval towns where people lived in close quarters. Agnes examined her comb carefully after each pass through her hair, looking for the tiny insects or their eggs. Finding them was not a mark of shame or poor hygiene, but simply a fact of life, like finding moths in stored wool. If she discovered lice, she would need to treat her hair with an infusion of herbs, possibly pennyroyal or tansy boiled in vinegar, and combed through repeatedly with the fine comb until the infestation was eliminated. Her mother checked all the children's heads regularly, and the family took immediate action at the first sign of trouble. Agnes had seen her younger siblings treated several times, and she knew the process well. After combing her hair thoroughly, Agnes plaited it into a long braid and pinned it up, then covered it with a fresh linen cap. Married women were expected to keep their hair completely covered, but even unmarried girls like Agnes kept their hair bound and mostly concealed when in public. This was partly modesty and partly practical, keeping hair clean and out of the way during work. The linen cap itself would need washing in a few days, along with her shifts and other small linens. Dressing was the next task, and Agnes paid attention to the state of her undergarments. She wore a long linen shift next to her skin, and this garment served multiple purposes in medieval hygiene. The linen absorbed sweat and oils from her body, protecting her outer clothes from becoming soiled too quickly. Linen was chosen specifically because it could be washed frequently and vigorously, unlike wool, which would shrink and felt if treated too harshly. Agnes changed her shift every few days, wearing one while another was in the wash. Her mother had taught her that keeping the linen next to one's skin clean was one of the most important aspects of personal hygiene. The shift acted as a barrier, and as long as it was changed and washed regularly, the body remained relatively clean, even if full bathing was infrequent. Over the shift, Agnes pulled on her everyday wool kirtle, a simple dress in a practical dark blue that would not show stains easily. The wool itself had been cleaned and fulled before being woven into cloth, and the lanolin in the wool gave it some natural water resistance. Wool did not need frequent washing the way linen did. In fact, washing wool garments too often would damage them. Instead, wool was brushed regularly to remove surface dirt, aired out frequently to keep it fresh, and spot cleaned when necessary. Agnes's mother had taught her to hang wool garments in the sun and fresh air whenever possible, as this helped remove odours and kept the fabric in good condition. On particularly sunny days, the family would hang all their wool clothing in the garden behind the bakery, and the combination of sunlight and fresh air worked remarkably well to refresh the garments. The bakery below began to stir as Agnes finished dressing, and she descended the narrow stairs to help her father with the morning's work. The bakehouse itself was immaculately maintained, as was required by guild regulations and town ordinances. Her father took enormous pride in keeping his workspace clean, knowing that any sign of uncleanliness could result in fines or even loss of his license to bake. The work surfaces were scrubbed daily with sand and hot water. The floor was swept multiple times a day and washed thoroughly each evening. The ovens were cleaned of ash regularly, and all tools and equipment were washed after use. This attention to cleanliness was not unique to her father's bakery. Throughout medieval towns, regulations enforced standards of hygiene, particularly for businesses that dealt with food or public health. Butchers were required to dispose of offal in designated areas outside town walls. Tanners, whose work was notoriously smelly and involved animal waste, were often required to set up their operations downstream and downwind of residential areas. Public latrines were maintained in larger towns, and there were strict rules about dumping waste in streets or water sources. The popular image of medieval towns as cesspits of filth was largely a myth, perpetuated by later centuries that wanted to emphasize their own supposed superiority. In reality, medieval people understood the connection between cleanliness and health, even if their understanding of the mechanisms differed from modern germ theory. After the morning rush of customers seeking fresh bread, Agnes and her mother turned their attention to household tasks. Today was washing day, which came around every week or two, depending on the weather and the family's supply of clean linens. Washing was a major undertaking that required significant time and effort, which is why it was done in batches rather than daily. Agnes's mother had been heating water in the large cauldron in the bakehouse since early morning, taking advantage of the residual heat from the bread ovens. By mid-morning, they had several buckets of hot water ready. They carried the water to the yard behind the bakery where the washing would take place. The dirty linens had been collected over the past weeks, the shifts and caps and towels and table linens all piled in a large basket. Agnes's mother added the linens to a large wooden tub and poured in the hot water. Then she added soap, which they made themselves twice a year in large batches. The soap was made from rendered fat and lye produced by running water through wood ash. It was a caustic substance that could burn skin if not handled carefully, and both Agnes and her mother knew to avoid getting it in cuts or near their eyes. The washing process was vigorous and thorough. Agnes and her mother used wooden paddles to agitate the linens in the hot soapy water, working the soap through the fabric. For particularly soiled items, they would lay them on a wooden board and beat them with the paddles, using physical force to drive out dirt. The heavily soiled areas, especially around necklines and underarms of shifts, received special attention. They might be rubbed directly with soap and scrubbed with brushes made of stiff bristles. The process was exhausting work, and both women's arms ached by the time they finished. After the washing came rinsing, which was equally important. The linens were transferred to another tub of clean water, agitated to remove the soap, then moved to yet another tub of fresh water for a final rinse. Any soap left in the fabric would irritate skin and also attract dirt more quickly. Once thoroughly rinsed, the linens were wrung out by hand, twisted and squeezed until most of the water was removed. Then they were hung on lines strung across the yard to dry in the sun and air. The sunlight helped bleach the linens whiter, and many housewives prized brilliantly white linens as a mark of good housekeeping. Some women used additional bleaching techniques, laying wet linens on grass and repeatedly wetting them with clean water over several days, allowing the combination of moisture, sunlight, and the grass itself to bleach the fabric. While the washing was underway, Agnes's younger sister Emma was responsible for another hygiene-related task, airing and freshening the bedding. She stripped the straw mattresses from the family's beds and carried them to the yard, beating them with a stick to remove dust and any insects that might have taken up residence. The bed linens, the sheets and blankets were hung over lines to air. The family changed their bed straw several times a year, replacing it with fresh, clean straw and often adding dried herbs like lavender or chamomile that would release pleasant scents and help repel insects. The wooden bed frames themselves were regularly checked for bed bugs, and if any infestation was found, the wood would be washed with vinegar or even scorched with flame to kill the pests. That afternoon, Agnes accompanied her mother to the public bathhouse on the edge of town. Bathhouses were common features in medieval towns and cities, and their existence challenges the widespread misconception that medieval people rarely bathed. The bathhouse in Norwich was a substantial building with separate sections for men and women, each containing several large wooden tubs. The water was heated by fires maintained throughout the day, and fresh water was regularly added to keep the baths clean. There was a small fee to use the facilities, affordable enough that even people of modest means could bathe regularly, perhaps once a week or every 2 weeks, depending on their circumstances and the season. Agnes and her mother paid their coins to the bathhouse keeper and entered the women's section. The room was warm and steamy, with several other women already bathing or preparing to bathe. There was a social aspect to the bathhouse, women chatting and exchanging news as they washed. Agnes and her mother undressed and stepped into one of the large tubs, the hot water enveloping them. The sensation was luxurious after a morning of hard work. They had brought small bundles containing cloths for washing and herbs to add to the water. Agnes's mother added a handful of dried rosemary to their bath, and the scent rose with the steam. They washed thoroughly, using cloths to scrub their skin and a mild soap for their hair. Agnes worked her fingers through her unbound hair, massaging her scalp and working the soap through to the ends. Her mother helped her rinse, pouring water from a bucket over her head until the soap was gone and her hair squeaked clean. They paid particular attention to feet which bore the brunt of daily walking on unpaved streets, and to hands which handled food and countless other tasks. The hot water opened pores and helped remove dirt and oils that accumulated despite daily washing of face and hands. After soaking and washing, they emerged from the bath and dried themselves with large linen towels. The bathhouse provided these for an additional small fee, thick, absorbent cloths that were washed regularly. Agnes felt clean and refreshed, her skin pink from the hot water and scrubbing. Her mother looked younger and more relaxed, the tensions of daily work temporarily eased. They dressed in the clean shifts they had brought with them, leaving their worn shifts with the bathhouse keeper, who would see them washed for a small additional charge, a service that saved housewives' labour. Not everyone could afford regular visits to the bathhouse, of course, but there were alternatives. Many households had wooden tubs that could be filled with heated water for bathing at home. This was more labour-intensive, requiring water to be heated in batches and carried to the tub, then disposed of afterward. It was typically done less frequently than bathhouse visits, perhaps monthly or for special occasions, but it was an option. Even those too poor to own a tub could wash thoroughly using a basin and cloth, heating small amounts of water and methodically cleaning all parts of the body in sequence. Medieval medical texts and religious writings consistently emphasized the importance of cleanliness, and people made efforts to maintain it within the constraints of their circumstances. The connection between cleanliness and health was well understood in medieval society, even if the explanations differed from modern understanding. Medical theory was based on the concept of humours, and many ailments were attributed to imbalances or corruptions of these humours. Cleanliness was seen as a way to maintain proper balance and prevent disease. Bathing, especially in water with added herbs, was believed to have therapeutic effects. Medical practitioners recommended bathing for various conditions, sometimes in plain water, sometimes in water infused with specific herbs chosen for their supposed properties. There were also religious motivations for cleanliness. Christianity emphasized both physical and spiritual purity, and cleanliness was seen as an outward manifestation of inner virtue. Monasteries and convents maintained high standards of hygiene, with regular bathing, clean clothing, and well-maintained facilities. Pilgrims preparing for important religious journeys would bathe and put on clean clothes as acts of purification. Saints were often described in hagiographies as being notably clean and sweet-smelling, their physical purity reflecting their spiritual state. Grooming tools were common possessions, found in households across the social spectrum. Combs were nearly universal, owned by rich and poor alike, made from wood, bone, or horn, depending on what one could afford. The wealthy might have combs made of ivory or decorated with intricate carvings, but even the simplest wooden comb served its essential purpose. Mirrors were also more common than many assume, made of polished metal or glass backed with metal. They were not as clear as modern mirrors, but they allowed people to see their faces well enough to check their appearance. Tweezers for removing unwanted hair were another common grooming tool. Both men and women used them to pluck eyebrows, remove stray facial hair, and generally maintain their appearance according to the beauty standards of the time. Scissors of various sizes were used for trimming hair, beards, and fingernails. Nail care was considered important, with clean, trimmed nails seen as a mark of good grooming. Dirty, overgrown nails were associated with labourers who worked with their hands in ways that made such maintenance difficult, and even they would clean and trim their nails when possible. Barbers and bathhouse keepers often provided grooming services beyond simple bathing. A barber might cut hair, trim beards, clean ears, and even provide minor medical services like bloodletting. These professionals were regulated by guilds that set standards for their work and maintained the reputation of the trade. A good barber was valued in the community, and people would develop long-standing relationships with particular practitioners whose skill they trusted. Perfumes and scented waters were used by those who could afford them. These ranged from simple herb-infused waters that anyone could make to expensive imported perfumes available only to the wealthy. Rose water was particularly popular, used for washing hands and face, and sometimes added to bath water. Lavender, rosemary, mint, and other herbs were incorporated into various preparations for their pleasant scents. Sachets of dried herbs were tucked into clothing chests to scent garments and repel moths and other insects. Deodorant in the modern sense did not exist, but people were aware of body odor and took steps to minimize it. Regular washing was the primary method, along with frequent changes of linen undergarments. Some people used powders made from ground herbs and minerals to absorb moisture and add scent. Aromatic herbs might be tucked into clothing, and the wealthy sometimes carried pomanders, decorative containers filled with aromatic substances, which they could hold to their noses to mask unpleasant smells. The evening brought its own hygiene rituals. Before bed, Agnes again washed her face and hands, removing the dirt and sweat accumulated during the day's work. She cleaned her teeth with the toothcloth, scrubbing away any remnants of the evening meal. She changed into a clean sleeping shift, different from the one she wore during the day. This practice of having separate clothing for sleeping helped keep beds cleaner and was recommended in medical texts of the period. The chamber pot kept under the bed was emptied first thing each morning, and the pot itself was washed regularly. Human waste was not simply tossed into the streets, as popular misconceptions suggest. In towns, there were designated cesspits, often shared between several households, that were periodically emptied by professional gong farmers who removed the waste at night and transported it outside the town walls. In rural areas, waste was typically buried or used as fertilizer for fields, following practices that modern understanding recognizes as reasonably sanitary when properly managed. Public health regulations in medieval towns show clear awareness of hygiene concerns. Butchers were required to clean their stalls regularly and dispose of waste properly. Wells were protected from contamination, with rules against allowing animals near them or washing clothing too close to water sources. Streets were required to be kept clean, with householders responsible for the areas in front of their properties. Many towns employed street cleaners who removed refuse. While these standards were not always perfectly maintained, their existence demonstrates that medieval people valued cleanliness and understood its importance. The medieval approach to hygiene was shaped by practical constraints. Water had to be fetched from wells or rivers and heated over fires, making the process labor-intensive. Soap required significant effort to make, though it was common enough that most households produced their own or could purchase it. Clothing was expensive and time-consuming to produce, so people owned fewer garments than we do today and had to make them last through careful maintenance. But within these constraints, medieval people developed effective hygiene practices. The climate and season affected hygiene routines significantly. In summer, when water was more readily available and drying was easier, washing happened more frequently. People might bathe more often, and washing day came around more regularly. In winter, the challenges of heating water and drying clothing made some aspects of hygiene more difficult, though people still maintained cleanliness through daily washing of exposed skin, regular changes of linen, and periodic full bathing when conditions permitted. Different social classes approached hygiene with varying resources, but similar underlying principles. The wealthy might bathe in private chambers with servants to heat and carry water, using expensive soaps and perfumes. They owned more clothing and could change garments more frequently, but even they followed the same basic practices of regular washing, clean linen next to the skin, and attention to grooming. The poor made do with less, but they too washed daily, changed their linen when they could, and visited bathhouses or bathed at home as their means allowed. Contrary to later myths, medieval people did not fear water or believed that bathing was dangerous. There were some medical concerns about bathing at certain times, such as immediately after eating or during illness, but these were specific cautions, not blanket prohibitions. The idea that medieval people rarely bathed is largely a fiction created by later centuries. Records show bathhouses operating throughout the medieval period. Medical texts recommend regular bathing, and personal accounts mention bathing as a normal part of life. The decline in public bathing that occurred in later centuries had specific causes. The spread of syphilis in the late 15th and 16th centuries led to bathhouses being seen as places where disease spread, particularly because some bathhouses had become associated with prostitution. Religious reformers, both Protestant and Catholic, condemned bathhouses for moral rather than hygienic reasons. Economic changes and shifts in medical theory also played roles. But during the medieval period proper, roughly from the 5th through 15th centuries, bathing and cleanliness were valued and practiced. Agnes's daily routine of washing, grooming, and maintaining cleanliness was typical for her time and place. She lived in a society that valued hygiene, understood its importance for health and social acceptance, and developed practical methods for maintaining it despite technological and economic constraints. The medieval period was not the age of filth that later stereotypes suggest. People washed, bathed, groomed themselves, cleaned their clothes and homes, and regulated public health. They did so with the tools and knowledge available to them, developing effective practices that served them well. The next time you hear someone repeat the old myth about filthy medieval people who never bathed, remember Agnes standing at her basin in the morning light, carefully washing her face and scrubbing her teeth, preparing to face another day in a world that valued cleanliness as much as any other. If you are enjoying this content, please consider joining our community of nighttime travelers by subscribing and turning on notifications to support our channel. The first light of dawn crept through the wooden shutters of Marjorie's cottage in the village of Ashwell in Hertfordshire in the year 1398. She was a widow of 32 years, her husband having died 3 years earlier from a fever that swept through the village. She lived now with her 2 young children, a daughter of 8 named Joan and a son of 6 named John, supporting them through her work as a seamstress and occasional midwife. The cottage was small, just 2 rooms with a loft where the children slept. But Marjorie kept it as clean as her mother had taught her, understanding that cleanliness was a virtue that cost little but brought great benefit. Marjorie rose from her bed, a simple wooden frame with a straw mattress that she had refreshed just a month ago with new straw and dried meadowsweet. The sweet scent of the herb still lingered faintly, though it would fade over the coming weeks. She had slept in a long linen shift, different from the one she wore during the day, and she kept this sleeping shift specifically for night time. The practice of having separate shifts for sleeping and waking hours was one her mother had insisted upon, saying it kept the bed cleaner and helped one rest better. Marjorie had continued the habit and taught it to her daughter as well. The water in the pitcher on her small table was cold, drawn from the village well the evening before and left to settle overnight. Marjorie poured some into a wooden washing bowl and splashed it on her face, gasping slightly at the chill, but relishing the way it drove away the last remnants of sleep. She used a cloth to scrub her face thoroughly, paying attention to her eyes and the creases around her nose and mouth. Her hands came next, and she washed them with particular care. As a midwife, she understood, perhaps better than most in the village, how important clean hands were. She had seen women die of childbed fever, and while she did not fully understand the mechanisms, she had observed that midwives who were fastidious about cleanliness seemed to have fewer mothers fall ill after birth. Her teeth required daily attention, and Marjorie developed her own mixture for cleaning them. She kept a small pot of powder made from ground charcoal mixed with crushed mint leaves and a bit of salt. The charcoal was slightly abrasive and helped remove stains. The mint provided a pleasant flavour and freshened her breath, and the salt helped keep her gums healthy. She wrapped a piece of clean linen around her finger, dipped it in the powder, and methodically scrubbed each tooth, front and back, working the cloth along her gum line as well. The process took several minutes, but Marjorie had learned from painful experience the importance of this daily ritual. She had lost 2 back teeth already, common enough at her age, but she was determined to keep the rest as long as possible. After cleaning her teeth, Marjorie used a small twig she had carefully prepared, frayed at one end by chewing it, to clean between her teeth and along her gums. Some people used sharpened quills, or even small pieces of bone for this purpose, but Marjorie preferred the softness of the frayed twig. She had learned this technique from an elderly woman in the village who still had most of her teeth at the remarkable age of 60, and Marjorie trusted the woman's methods. The twig could be used for several days before needing replacement, and hazel twigs seemed to work particularly well, having a slightly astringent quality that left her mouth feeling fresh. Her hair was next, and Marjorie removed the cloth cap she had slept in and unpinned her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. At 32, her dark brown hair was beginning to show a few threads of grey at her temples, but it was still thick and healthy. She took up her comb, made of horn with teeth on both sides, coarse and fine. The comb had belonged to her mother and was one of Marjorie's most treasured possessions. She began with the coarse side, working through any tangles with patient strokes, then switched to the fine side for a thorough combing. The fine combing served multiple purposes beyond simply detangling. It distributed the natural oils from her scalp through the length of her hair, keeping it healthy and preventing it from becoming too dry and brittle. It also allowed her to check carefully for lice or their eggs. Marjorie examined the comb after each pass, looking for the telltale signs of infestation. Finding lice was no cause for shame, but it required immediate action. She kept a bottle of vinegar infused with wormwood specifically for treating lice when they appeared. The mixture was unpleasant smelling but effective, and she would comb it through her hair repeatedly with the fine comb until every last louse and egg was removed. Today her comb came away clean, and Marjorie was satisfied. She plaited her hair into a single long braid and coiled it at the back of her head, pinning it securely. Over this she placed a clean linen coif that covered her hair completely. Married women and widows were expected to keep their hair covered at all times, in public, and even at home. Marjorie usually kept hers bound and covered. It was both a mark of respectability and a practical measure that kept her hair cleaner and out of the way while she worked. She changed from her sleeping shift into her day shift, a fresh one she had washed 3 days ago. The shift was made of linen, undyed and simple, but clean and well maintained. Linen was ideal for undergarments because it could withstand frequent washing in hot water and even boiling without being damaged. Marjorie owned 3 shifts, which allowed her to always have one clean, one being worn, and one in the wash. She changed her shift every 3 or 4 days in normal weather, more frequently in summer when she perspired more from her work. The shift absorbed sweat and oils from her skin, protecting her outer garments and allowing them to stay cleaner longer. Over the shift, Marjorie put on her everyday gown, a simple wool dress in a practical brown colour. The wool itself required different care than linen. Marjorie rarely washed her wool gowns with water, as this would cause them to shrink and lose their shape. Instead, she brushed them regularly with a stiff brush to remove surface dirt and dust. She aired them frequently, hanging them outside on sunny days to let the fresh air and sunlight refresh the fabric. When spots or stains appeared, she cleaned them carefully with a damp cloth, or, for grease stains, with a paste made from fuller's earth that absorbed the oil. The children were stirring in the loft above, and Marjorie called up to them to wake and come down. Joan descended the ladder first, followed by her younger brother John. Marjorie had trained both children in proper hygiene from their earliest years, knowing that good habits formed young would serve them throughout their lives. She poured water into the washing bowl for each child in turn, supervising as they washed their faces and hands. Joan, at 8, could manage her own tooth cleaning, and Marjorie watched to ensure she did it thoroughly. John still needed help, and Marjorie wrapped the cloth around her own finger and cleaned his teeth for him, making it into a bit of a game so he would not fuss. She combed both children's hair carefully, checking for lice as she did her own. Children were particularly prone to lice because they played together in close contact, and Marjorie checked their heads several times a week. Today both came up clean, and she was pleased. She braided Joan's hair and covered it with a small coif, and trimmed John's hair herself every few weeks to keep it neat and short. A boy's hair was easier to maintain short, and it was both cooler and cleaner that way. After the morning routine, Marjorie turned her attention to the cottage itself. Cleanliness of one's home was considered as important as personal cleanliness, and Marjorie took pride in maintaining her small space. The floor was packed earth covered with a layer of rushes mixed with dried herbs. These rushes needed regular attention, and Marjorie swept them daily, pushing them into corners to collect the day's dirt and debris. Once a week, she removed the soiled rushes completely and replaced them with fresh ones, scattering dried lavender, mint and tansy among them. These herbs released pleasant scents when walked upon, and also helped discourage fleas and other insects. The walls were plastered and whitewashed, and Marjorie refreshed the whitewash each spring, which not only brightened the cottage but also helped keep it clean. Whitewash was mildly antiseptic due to the lime it contained, and the bright white surface made it easy to see any dirt or soot that accumulated. The cottage's few pieces of furniture, a table, benches, a chest for storage, and the bed frame were all scrubbed regularly with water and sand. Marjorie kept her cooking pot scoured clean, her dishes washed after each use, and her eating utensils free of tarnish and grime. The privy was located a short distance from the cottage, a simple structure over a deep pit. Marjorie maintained it carefully, adding layers of ash from the fire to help control odours and speed decomposition. When the pit filled, which happened every year or two, she would have it emptied by one of the village men who performed such tasks for a small fee. The waste was taken away from the village and buried or used as fertiliser for fields. The privy itself was scrubbed periodically, and Marjorie kept a bucket of water and a cloth nearby for washing hands after use, a practice not everyone followed, but one she considered essential. Today was Monday, and in Marjorie's household, Monday was washing day. She had been collecting soiled linens throughout the previous week in a large basket, the shifts and coifs and towels and cloths that needed cleaning. Washing was an exhausting task that took most of the day, but Marjorie had developed an efficient system over the years. She began by heating water in her largest cauldron over the fire. While the water heated, she sorted the linens by how soiled they were. Lightly soiled items could be washed together quickly, while heavily soiled items needed more aggressive treatment. The soap Marjorie used was one she made herself twice a year in large batches. She rendered fat from meat scraps and bones, then combined it with lye she made by filtering water through wood ash. The process was somewhat dangerous, as lye could burn skin, but Marjorie was experienced and careful. The resulting soap was grey and somewhat harsh, but it was effective and cost her nothing but time and effort. She shaved pieces from the large block of soap into the hot water, stirring until they dissolved. Joan helped her mother with the washing, learning the skills she would need in her own household someday. Together they added the linens to the hot soapy water in a large wooden tub and agitated them with wooden paddles. The heavily soiled items, particularly John's shirts, which bore the stains of an active 6-year-old boy, were laid on a wooden board and scrubbed with brushes or beaten with paddles to drive out the dirt. Marjorie paid special attention to the necklines and underarms of shifts, where sweat and body oils accumulated most heavily. She rubbed these areas directly with soap and scrubbed them vigorously. The washing water quickly became grey with released dirt, which always gave Marjorie satisfaction. It was visible proof that her efforts were effective. After the initial wash, the linens were transferred to a tub of clean water for rinsing. This step was crucial, as any soap left in the fabric would irritate skin and also attract dirt more quickly. Marjorie rinsed each item thoroughly, sometimes going through 2 or even 3 changes of rinse water to ensure all soap was removed. The rinsed linens were then wrung out by hand, twisted and squeezed to remove as much water as possible. Drying the washing depended entirely on weather. Today was a fine spring day with good sun and a light breeze, perfect for drying. Marjorie and Joan carried the wet linens to the small plot of grass behind the cottage and spread them out in the sun. Some items were hung on a rope strung between 2 posts, others were laid directly on the grass. The sun would help bleach them whiter, which was desirable, and the fresh air would give them a clean, pleasant smell. On rainy days or in winter, wet laundry had to be dried indoors near the fire, which took much longer and made the cottage damp and uncomfortable. But there was no alternative. While the washing dried, Marjorie turned her attention to other tasks. She had mending to do for several customers in the village, seams to repair and hems to let down for growing children. But first, she wanted to prepare for a washing of her own. Once a week in fair weather, Marjorie heated water for a proper bath. She had a large wooden tub that she brought into the cottage and filled with heated water. It was a luxury that not everyone could manage, but Marjorie considered it essential for her health and well-being. She heated multiple pots of water and poured them into the tub, testing the temperature with her hand until it was comfortably hot. She had gathered some rosemary from her small herb garden and added it to the water, releasing its aromatic oils. Rosemary was said to strengthen and invigorate, and Marjorie enjoyed its clean, sharp scent. She sent the children outside to play in the yard, where they would be safe and occupied, then undressed and stepped into the tub. The sensation of hot water enveloping her body was wonderful, a weekly pleasure she cherished. She sank down until the water came up to her shoulders, letting the heat soak into her muscles, easing the aches from constant labor. She took a cloth and her soap and washed herself thoroughly, starting with her face and working down. She scrubbed her arms and shoulders, her breasts and belly, her legs and feet. She paid particular attention to her feet, which were often dirty from walking on unpaved paths and floors, using a pumice stone to scrub away rough, dead skin from her heels and the balls of her feet. She washed her hair as well, working soap through it and then rinsing it multiple times with clean water she had kept in reserve. Washing her hair was time-consuming because of its length, but she did it weekly, believing that clean hair was healthier and more comfortable. After washing, she would sometimes rinse her hair with an infusion of chamomile or nettle, herbs that were said to strengthen hair and give it shine. Today, she used chamomile, pouring the fragrant liquid through her hair as a final rinse. After her bath, Marjorie dried herself with a large linen towel and dressed in clean clothes from the skin out. She felt refreshed and renewed, ready to face the rest of the week's work. The bath water, now grey with dirt, she saved to use for washing the floor or other cleaning tasks. Nothing was wasted in a household like Marjorie's, where economy was essential to survival. Not everyone in the village could manage a weekly bath at home, and for those people, the village had an arrangement with a woman who maintained a bathhouse of sorts in her cottage. For a small fee, villagers could use her facilities, which included a large tub and heated water. Some villages also had access to the public bathhouses in nearby towns, which people might visit on market days. Marjorie's ability to bathe at home was partly due to her access to hot water from cooking fires, and partly due to her determination to prioritize this aspect of hygiene. The afternoon brought a visit from her neighbor, Beatrice, who was expecting her third child in a few weeks and had come to consult with Marjorie about the upcoming birth. Before they discussed anything, Marjorie insisted that Beatrice wash her hands in the basin of clean water Marjorie provided. This might have seemed odd to some, but Beatrice knew Marjorie's ways and complied without question. Marjorie herself washed her hands again before examining Beatrice, a ritual she performed before and after any contact with expectant mothers or newborns. Marjorie's insistence on clean hands and clean conditions during childbirth had earned her a reputation as one of the safer midwives in the region. She could not explain exactly why cleanliness mattered, but she had observed that mothers attended by clean midwives in clean conditions seemed to recover better than those whose births were attended in less hygienic circumstances. She always ensured that the birthing chamber was as clean as possible, that linens were freshly washed, that her hands and any tools she used were scrupulously clean. When other midwives scoffed at her excessive washing, she simply pointed to her record of healthy mothers and babies and continued her practices. As evening approached, Marjorie brought in the dry washing from the yard. The linens were stiff and sweet-smelling, bleached a bit whiter by the sun. She folded them carefully and put them away in her chest, feeling satisfaction at the stack of clean shifts and the knowledge that she and her children would have fresh, clean clothes for the coming week. The chest itself was kept clean and had dried lavender scattered in it to scent the clothes and discourage moths. The evening meal was simple: pottage made from beans and vegetables with some bacon for flavour, served with bread. Before eating, everyone washed their hands, a ritual Marjorie insisted upon before every meal. She had taught her children that eating with dirty hands was not only unpleasant, but could make one sick, and the habit was now so ingrained that they did it automatically. After the meal, they washed their hands again and cleaned their teeth before bed. As darkness fell, Marjorie performed her evening ablutions. She washed her face and hands once more, removing the day's accumulation of dirt. She cleaned her teeth again, scrubbing away any remnants of the evening meal. She helped the children with their own washing and tooth cleaning, then sent them up to the loft to sleep. She changed into her sleeping shift and brushed out her hair, combing it thoroughly before plaiting it loosely for the night. The loose plait kept her hair from tangling while she slept, but was not so tight as to be uncomfortable. Before climbing into bed, Marjorie checked the chamber pot kept beneath it. The pot was emptied and cleaned every morning without fail, and Marjorie kept it as clean as any other vessel in the house. In the morning, the contents would be taken to the privy to be disposed of properly, and the pot would be washed with hot water before being returned to its place. Marjorie's life was not unusual for a medieval woman of her class and circumstances. Her attention to hygiene, her daily washing, her regular tooth cleaning, her weekly bathing, and her careful maintenance of her home and clothing were typical of people who understood the importance of cleanliness. Medieval people were not ignorant of hygiene, nor indifferent to it. They washed, they bathed, they cleaned their homes, they maintained their clothing, and they developed practical methods for doing so within the constraints of their technology and resources. The resources available for hygiene varied by social class, but the principles remained the same across society. Wealthy households might have servants to heat water and do washing. They might use expensive imported soaps and perfumes. They might have private bathrooms with lead-lined tubs. But they followed the same basic practices of regular washing, clean linen next to the skin, and attention to grooming. Marjorie, with her modest resources, maintained standards of cleanliness that would not have seemed out of place in a much wealthier household. The medieval understanding of why cleanliness mattered was based on the medical theories of the time, primarily the concept of humours and miasmas. People believed that foul air and corrupted substances could cause disease, and cleanliness was seen as a way to prevent such corruption. While this understanding was not scientifically accurate by modern standards, it led to hygiene practices that were in fact effective at preventing disease, even if the explanations for why they worked were incorrect. Religious teachings reinforced the importance of cleanliness. Christianity associated cleanliness with godliness, and being clean was seen as a reflection of one's moral state. Saints were described in their hagiographies as being notably clean and sweet-smelling. Pilgrims prepared for important religious journeys by bathing and putting on clean clothes. Monks and nuns followed strict hygiene regimens as part of their monastic rules. This religious dimension added moral weight to practices that also had practical health benefits. The decline in public bathing that occurred in later centuries, particularly after the medieval period, had specific causes unrelated to medieval attitudes toward cleanliness. The spread of syphilis in the late 15th and 16th centuries led to bathhouses being associated with disease transmission. Some bathhouses had become associated with prostitution, leading religious reformers to condemn them. Economic changes and shifts in medical theory also played roles. but during the high and late medieval periods, bathing was common and valued. Village life, like Marjorie's in Ashwell, operated according to customs and regulations that promoted cleanliness. The village well was protected from contamination, with strict rules about what activities could take place near it. Animals were not allowed to water at the well. They had their own watering places downstream. Washing of clothes or people could not take place at the well itself, but at a separate location. The village appointed officials to enforce these rules, understanding that clean water was essential for health. The village also had regulations about waste disposal. Human waste was kept in privies or buried away from water sources. Animal manure was collected for use as fertilizer, but had to be stored at appropriate distances from wells and dwellings. Butchering of animals could only take place in designated areas, and the remains had to be disposed of properly. Dead animals had to be buried or taken away from the village quickly. These regulations show clear understanding that cleanliness and proper waste management were important for community health. Seasonal rhythms affected hygiene practices. Summer, with its warmer weather and longer days, was the easiest time for maintaining cleanliness. Water did not need as much heating, clothes dried quickly, and bathing was more pleasant. People might bathe more frequently in summer, and certainly washed clothes more often. Winter presented challenges, as water had to be heated over fires, and wet clothes took much longer to dry. But even in winter, people maintained their hygiene through daily washing of face and hands, regular changes of linen when possible, and periodic full bathing when conditions allowed. The tools and materials for hygiene were simple but effective. A basin, a pitcher, some cloths, soap, a comb, perhaps a mirror. These items were within reach of most people, and even the poorest households would have at least basic versions. The knowledge of how to use these tools was passed down through families, with mothers teaching daughters and fathers teaching sons, the practices that would serve them throughout their lives. This intergenerational transmission of hygiene knowledge ensured that standards were maintained across time. Marjorie, lying in her bed in her clean sleeping shift, in her cottage with fresh rushes on the floor, with her clean children sleeping in the loft above, was not an anomaly, but a representative example of medieval hygiene practices. She lived in a society that valued cleanliness, understood its importance, and maintained it through daily effort. The stereotype of filthy medieval people living in squalor is largely a creation of later centuries that wanted to emphasize their own supposed progress and superiority. The reality, as Marjorie's life demonstrates, was quite different. Medieval people washed, bathed, groomed themselves, maintained their homes and clothing, and lived according to standards of hygiene that were reasonable and effective given their circumstances. They were not so different from us, after all, in their desire to be clean, healthy, and comfortable in their own bodies and home.